Two groups of impassioned protesters facing off on the street. Most on both sides have an Indian background. But this isn't Delhi or anywhere else in India. These are the streets of Toronto, Canada in July of 2023. Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a leader of the Canadian Sikh community and a separatist activist, had been gunned down just weeks before. For his supporters, the responsibility was clear.
The assassination was committed by Indian agencies.
The government of India behind a murder? It was a bold claim, but then the claim received support from Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
There's been a major development in the killing of a Sikh activist.
Growing diplomatic
spat.
India reacted furiously, calling the allegations absurd. Both countries expelled diplomats. India shut down visa services. Indian Foreign Ministry even accused Canada of being
as a safe haven for terrorists, for extremists, and for organized crime.
Diplomatic relations between the two countries hit an all-time low in October 2024. Canadian officials suggested that the High Commissioner, India's highest-ranking diplomat in Canada, and other Indian officials were persons of interest in Nijjar's murder investigation.
6 agents of the government of India are persons of interest in criminal activities.
India announced the withdrawal of its High Commissioner and other diplomats. On the same day, October 14th, it also announced that 6 Canadian diplomats, including Acting High Commissioner Stewart Ross Wheeler, had been asked to leave the country.
We will naturally reject false imputations against our diplomats.
So how did things escalate so quickly to become the worst diplomatic dispute in India-Canada relations?
Very serious matter, and we're still not recovered from it.
To understand this conflict, we must go back in time. It involves the story of Sikh separatism, the assassination of a prime minister, mob violence that killed thousands of Sikhs, and a terrorist attack. It is also about politics, a lot of politics. We start, though, in Canada. A yellow spot on the ground. That's all that remains. This is where Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the Sikh separatist leader, was killed. On June 18, 2023, masked gunmen shot him in the parking lot of the Sikh Gurdwara he led. Nijjar was a Sikh religious leader and a political activist. His cause? Khalistan, an independent Sikh homeland carved out of the Indian state of Punjab. The region was divided between India and Pakistan in 1947. Nijjar was an activist in Canada, but in India, where he was born, he was a designated terrorist. The government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi accused him of orchestrating murders and financing terror activities. For India, the Khalistan independence movement that Nijjar supported has a dark history of violence. But before we get there, let's learn more about Sikhs first. This is the Golden Temple in the city of Amritsar, Punjab. It is the holiest site of the Sikh religion and plays a crucial role in our story. Sikhism originated in the 15th century in India. Sikhs came to be known as warriors. Today, they are a respected community residing mostly in India's Punjab region, where they form the majority. Overall in India, Sikhs represent just 1.7% of the total population. The demand for a Sikh homeland, Khalistan, is not new and has mostly been pursued peacefully. But in the 1970s, the movement became more radicalized. By 1984, the situation escalated.
They really want to recapture that glory. And it's something psychological in most Sikhs.
Rahul Bedi is a senior journalist and author who closely covered Punjab during the insurgency.
The Khalistan movement dates back to the 70s, when there was a perceived discrimination that the Sikhs felt they were being discriminated against by the federal government. And this led over a period of the next 15 or 20 years. The Akali Dal was the only party, and the Sikhs were the only people who actually opposed the emergency that Mrs. Gandhi imposed in 1975. And it was a vindictiveness on the part of Mrs. Gandhi to break the Sikh community. This led to an exacerbation of the movement, which then culminated in extreme violence and extreme terrorism.
Do you remember the Golden Temple? In 1984, Sikh separatists occupied the temple when it was full of worshippers. The Indian army stormed it in a hastily planned operation. Hundreds died, including the Khalistan leadership. More chaos followed. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who gave the controversial order to storm the Golden Temple, was gunned down by her Sikh bodyguards at her residence in Delhi. The assassination unleashed a wave of anti-Sikh mob violence that left thousands of dead across India.
I remember how what terror and what fear there was throughout the state of Punjab. Punjab used to close down at 4:30, 5 o'clock. There was no movement on the roads, and this activity went on for about at least 8 or 10 years.
To escape the Indian government, many Khalistan supporters moved abroad, especially to countries with established Sikh communities like Canada, Britain, the US, Australia, Germany, and New Zealand.
So you have this, that the balkanization of India was a scheme put up by the neo-colonialists, neo-imperialists abroad.
Pushpesh Pant is an Indian academic and historian. He retired as a professor of international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi.
It is the former colonial powers which provided shelter and refuge to disgruntled elements of the Sikh community, particularly the violent variety who wanted Ladke Lenge Khalistan variety, in England, in Canada, in other areas where Indian diaspora was there.
Even in 1983, radical Sikhs outside India had already created tensions between Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her Canadian counterpart Pierre Trudeau, the father of the current Canadian Prime Minister. But in 1985, an even greater trauma rocked relations between India and Canada. A bomb on an Air India passenger flight from Toronto exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 329 people on board. Most of the victims were Canadian, many of Indian origin. Khalistani extremists were blamed for the terrorist attack. Despite arrests and more than 20 years of investigation, only one person was convicted and served just 5 years for manslaughter. This left many Indians deeply disappointed and doubtful of Canadian justice.
Well, disappointed is probably understating it. I mean, the Indians were quite justifiably infuriated, and repeatedly so, by the failure of the Canadian police to take the threat seriously.
Terry Malewski is a senior journalist from Canada who has closely followed the Sikh separatist movement in Canada and India.
During the heyday of the Sikh insurgency, during the 1980s and the early 90s, and it wasn't just a failure of the police for looking the other way, destroying evidence, wiping out the wiretaps. These suspects were under surveillance for 3 months before the bombing, and still they didn't figure out what was going on. After witnesses had been killed, others intimidated, and the Canadian justice system just didn't seem to be tough-minded enough to realize that the lawyers were playing clever games, saying all this evidence was inadmissible on technical, legalistic grounds.
While the idea of Khalistan persisted in Canada, it continued to overshadow relations with India. Justin Trudeau's 2018 state visit to India became a diplomatic disaster. Tensions between the two states became personal between the leaders.
Well, 2 words, Jaspal Atwal. That's the name of a convicted Khalistani terrorist, convicted in the attempted assassination of a visiting Punjabi cabinet minister, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, on Vancouver Island in 1986. And why that matters is because this same Jaspal Atwal, despite his criminal reputation, appeared to be an honored guest of the visiting Prime Minister Trudeau in India, in both Mumbai and in New Delhi, of course it would be a diplomatic disaster. And when they realized it, of course, they backpedaled frantically, but it didn't do any good. The damage was done.
The Indian government gave Trudeau the cold shoulder. He was received by a junior minister on arrival. He later visited Punjab and the Golden Temple. Modi seemed to have no time for Trudeau until the end of his trip. The Indian Prime Minister finally received him, but went public with his criticism of Canada for hosting Khalistan supporters.
संप्रदाय का राजनीतिक उद्देश्य के लिए दुरुपयोग करने वालों और बंटवारे की खाई खोदने वालों के लिए कोई जगह नहीं होनी चाहिए.
So how significant is the Khalistan movement within India today?
I can very categorically say that there is very little support for Khalistan on the ground in Punjab today. Nobody wants to go back to those days in the 80s and 90s. I was a young reporter in those days. I was covering Punjab for an Indian newspaper. So nobody wants to return to those dark days of Punjab because they were very regressive and they were full of fear and terror.
Why Khalistani movement is not strong in India? Because the Sikhs, remember, they are a microscopic, minuscule minority. And if they take an aggressive stance, what they might be confronted with in the highly polarized climate of contemporary India, another backlash.
But why is the movement still such a thorn in the eye of the Indian government?
It doesn't have any support currently, but it's very much alive amongst the Sikh leadership and the Sikh community in places like Canada and the UK, and to some extent in the United States, because those people are living in a time wrap of the 70s or the 80s, because that is the time when they immigrated to these countries and they carried their prejudices and their feelings and their emotions with them. And that is what is disturbing the federal government in India. And that is what has led to a breakdown in diplomatic relations between Canada and India. And also to a certain extent, this has been festering with the UK also, because all these groups in UK and Canada are continually carrying out local demonstrations and local activism, which disturbs the government in Delhi.
But would India go as far as killing someone in a friendly country? In May 2024, Canadian authorities arrested 3 Indian nationals living in Canada. They have been charged in Nijjar's murder case.
There are separate and distinct investigations ongoing into these matters, certainly not limited to the involvement of the people arrested today. And these efforts include investigating connections to the government of India.
2 months after Trudeau's allegations against Indian agents, the US also accused India of plotting to assassinate a top Khalistan movement leader, Guru Patwant Singh Pannu, on American soil. 2 Khalistani leaders were also shot dead in Pakistan. India was blamed for these deaths and attempted crimes, but the Indian government refutes all the allegations.
Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty.
Accusations from other governments against India had only been discussed behind closed doors until Justin Trudeau went public after Nijjar's murder. So little was known at the time. Why did the Canadian Prime Minister make such a bold accusation? It might have something to do with domestic politics in Canada. Canada has a significant Sikh diaspora. Today, around 780,000 Sikhs live in the country. They account for only 2.1% of the total population. However, the Sikh community in Canada is highly active in politics. There are 18 Sikh MPs in the Canadian Parliament, and the New Democratic Party, one of Canada's largest political parties, is led by Jagmeet Singh, a Canadian Sikh. The NDP had previously supported Trudeau's minority government.
The words Sikh and Khalistani don't mean the same thing. If you're talking about how influential are the Sikhs in general, they're very influential. They are a large voting bloc, but they are very far. There's only a small minority that are Khalistanis, and those are the most noisy. Those are the ones with the most influence because they turn out at election time. They offer to provide blocks of votes in return for the Canadian government, whoever's elected, singing their tune, looking the other way at their Vaisakhi parades as they run pictures of gun-toting Sikh assassins and martyrs through the streets of Canada and Toronto and Vancouver, principally at Vaisakhi. And it's an amazing thing that this is tolerated, as though, I mean, would we tolerate Osama bin Laden having his picture paraded through Canadian streets? Probably not.
I think the Canadians overestimated the bluster of Mr. Trudeau. Modi was not going to buckle under pressure from Trudeau because Mr. Modi could possibly have a totally different tune if Trump was the president or even if the US president in Biden.
Ever wonder why other Western leaders aren't as vocal as Trudeau? Well, it's all about strategy. They're cautious not to upset India as they want its support in a potential shutdown with China, a delicate balancing act.
I don't think the West, whether it is Australia, whether it is US, UK, New Zealand, or Canada, will alienate India to any large extent because they need India. India is geographically located at a spot which is of interest to all these Western countries because it is a neighbor of China's, and it cannot, none of these countries can confront China without India's support.
But that doesn't mean Western allies aren't taking this seriously. They've expressed serious concerns.
The US did provide evidence, and they had the Indians on the back foot. They dismissed the Canadian allegation. They did not dismiss the US allegation, which was the same allegation. And my expectation is that in future, the Canada-India relationship is going to depend not so much on Canada and India. It's going to depend on the United States because they're not going to put up with the Indians sweeping this all under the rug.
So where do we go from here? Both countries have their motives, and we've seen what's behind the conflict between India and Canada. How close are they really? Economic ties, immigration from India to Canada, particularly of students, and India's growing global role, especially as a bulwark against China, are all significant factors.
The US settles with India. Okay, we've got a way forward. You're accepting responsibility. You're not going to do it again. Then Canada will fall into line. It doesn't have the clout to go a different way.
So will the recent allegations change the dynamic? Or are relations between India and the West headed for more conflict? Well, only time will tell.